Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Stoff. I am moderating this session as I have for many years. I was director of Plan II for 11 years and enjoyed every single minute of it. I'm very glad to see you all here. We have four very interesting presentations on this session, which is titled Women and the Politics of Resistance. We're going to go in the same order in which the students' names appear on the program. We will begin with Samantha. We have about 8 minutes per presentation, and then we have about 6 to 8 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to submit your questions on the chat feature, and then I will read your name and the question to our symposium panelists. So Samantha, if you would like to begin, Samantha will be talking about female representation and power, how language impacts women's representation. And Samantha, if you will turn on your video and audio, we'll be able to see you and hear you.
Yes, give me one moment.
Okay, I will do that. While we're waiting for Samantha, this is my first video symposium. I've done many of them live, and I'm curious to see how this works. Ah, there's Samantha. Samantha, you are on.
Okay, let me know if you can see that view.
I certainly can.
Is it in presentation mode?
I think so. I can read it very clearly. You've got
okay, perfect.
The title up there.
Okay, great. So I'm going to, I'm going to start off with my presentation, which is titled Female Representation and Power, How Language Impacts Women's Representation. So the first thing I want to kind of explore is women in leadership. So the status of women globally, what does that look like today? So despite the increased support we see for more egalitarian attitudes and greater representation, or the perception of greater representation of women in public life, for example, in politics, and in important corporate level executive positions, what do these statistics actually look like? So we see that actually less than 50% of working age women are in the labor market globally. And if we look at that data down here, we see that, 24.9% of women around the world make up parliamentary or elected offices in government as of 2020. So how does this affect women's leadership in government and in corporate positions? So next we go to challenges faced by women. So because there are factors that impact women's representation within the global patterns that we see in the election of women, there are certain challenges such as institutional and structural factors, as well as cultural factors that impact the ability of women to obtain leadership positions. So from there, we'll mainly explore culture as a factor. So culture affects the way that we think and what we say. So in this, we will explore how culture thus affects women's representation. So first of all, we must understand how language affects culture as an effect of culture, also as a factor of culture. Language also has a relationship that is integral with culture as well. Not only does culture impact language, but culture also has an effect on, but language also has an effect on culture. Thus, by looking at the linguistic mechanisms in defining language and how it can be used in a gendered context, we can understand how culture affects what we say and what we think in terms of women's representation. So basically, in conclusion, we can understand how language is a medium of expression, and thus language contributes to a male-dominated worldview. So it's very important to understand the relationship between language and culture and how it impacts political and corporate leadership. So my thesis in particular will focus on how the US and Mexico fit into the global patterns of women's representation. And so if we look into these studies, I will analyze the United States and English language to understand how English language use impacts female leadership in the US, to confirm that women's representation is impacted by language use within this society. And then my second case study is Mexico, and it will be exploring Spanish language use and how it impacts women's representation within this culture as well. So overall, we can understand women in leadership and the global status of female representation under the lens of recent political events, which shed light to the misunderstood or perhaps slanted perception that women have achieved more visibility and representation that they actually have. For example, or the first example would be the election of Vice President Kamala Harris as the first woman to the US office. But this contrasts to a lot of the statistical data of women's status worldwide. And surprisingly, the US isn't even a leader in gender equality, although we interpret recent events as important and progressive steps forward. So understanding language as a mechanism of culture and understanding how language and culture as an interconnected relationship impact women's representation is ultimately how my thesis will explore why women continue to be underrepresented in corporate and in political leadership positions.
Okay, have you finished?
Yes.
Okay, good. Some questions, perhaps. Let me start off and ask you a couple of questions. Could you tell us how you came upon this topic and what questions you brought to the research?
So I initially came upon this topic because of my interest, well, I guess my major, international relations, and thus my interest in language. I studied both Spanish and French throughout high school, all 4 years. And I've always really liked traveling. I studied abroad in Spain for 2 weeks in high school and in Shanghai for 2 months right before my sophomore year of college. So understanding how cultures interact and how language interacts with culture has always been something that really interested me. And in addition to that, I wanted to kind of incorporate how both my other academic studies in international relations, as well as my minor in business, how that impacted women within this realm, and how these potential cultural factors could be obstacles that are present for women trying to gain more equal representation and power.
And could you tell us a little bit about the method you used? What methodology did you use to approach this question?
So the methodology I initially used to approach this question is what do the statistics look like globally for women's representation? And then from there, what are two countries or languages that I know or have an understanding of that I can use as examples of case studies to go through and understand women's leadership? So going from there, understanding the broad status of women globally, and then how the US and Mexico fit into this, allowed me to come across language as a factor that impacts women's representation. And then from there,
no, I'm sorry. I thought you would pause, so I jumped right in, but please continue.
Sorry, no, you can, if there's a further question, that was kind of the initial.
Okay, so I have a question here from Lisa. Did you find the impact greater in different countries or languages than others?
So there's definitely a lot of research to be done on this topic. Generally, the information juxtaposes developing nations with post-industrial or developed nations, or it just explores one individual country. So the impact that we have generally seen on women's representation is that more developed nations typically have more egalitarian views, as well as greater representation of women within the government. However, the US and Mexico present an interesting kind of rebuttal of this, because the US would be considered a more developed nation than Mexico is. However, we find that Mexico has a greater proportion of women elected into political office than the US does.
Huh, that's really interesting. How would you account for that?
There's a lot of different factors that structural and institutional factors that I can kind of broadly go over, but that, political parties differ between the two nations, and between political parties, there's different sentiments or levels of egalitarian issues or attitudes towards issues. Another factor would be in Mexico, I guess, it's more of like a, I guess for local like politicians to enter, it's a lot less competitive, and the culture is a lot more receptive to newcomers and people who are bringing new ideas and innovation. So the local level of politics also is a really important and big facilitator of entry into political office and political power for Mexican women.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Samantha. I don't see any other questions coming from the audience. And so I think we'll move on to our next presenter, Brittney Colbath. Brittney is going to talk about founding females using US success to inform Korean discourse in improving the number of women in entrepreneurship. I love the title, Founding Females. Brittney, I love alliteration. So very, very nice.
Thank you. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay, well, hello everybody. My name is Brittney Colbath, and I am going to be presenting my thesis, Founding Females. In a short synopsis, it is basically a comparison between the United States and Korea's entrepreneurial environments and numbers for women, and basically how we can use the United States' success in this area to inform future discourse for Korea to also have success. So, why Korea? This is a question I got a lot in the beginning of my thesis, and I still get a lot today. And I attribute a lot of that to my grandmother, pictured here. She's such a big part of my life and has been such a guiding light in my life. And honestly, I felt as though I didn't know enough about my Korean heritage, and it was something that I really wanted to learn a lot more about. And so this thesis through Plan II really presented a unique opportunity for me to learn about something that's very personal and dear to my heart, but also something that's an interest for me career-wise and for the future. So I'll go ahead and get into the problem. So globally, I think, well, for the most part, it is pretty widely understood that there is a gender gap in business. And in general, women just do not start businesses as often as men do. And a lot of that has to do with something I'll refer to a few times in this presentation called the entrepreneurial environment. And this is basically just the different things in your country that either contribute to or hinder you from being able to start a business. So the problem that I found actually last year in my international business course while I was studying Korean economics is that Korea is in very good standing right now. And they've had such a big jump from a very primarily agricultural society to a very developed, highly research and development focused economy that's in good relations with the rest of the world and in very highly integrated into global organizations. They have a democratic government, a super strong economy with a positive BOP surplus, and very positive relationship, not only with the United States, but as I said, on a global scale. So all of these things added together, I mean, naturally in my mind, should have added up to a strong entrepreneurial environment. And in a lot of ways it did. But when I looked at the problem on the scale for women, the numbers didn't really add up as much. As you can see in this little chart here, on the Female Entrepreneurship Index in 2015, the United States was ranked #1 in number and environment for women to pursue starting a business, and Korea ranked 43rd. And on the MasterCard Index of Women in Entrepreneurship of 2020, so last year, the United States only fell back to 2nd place, and Korea was still ranked 38 on this index. So I think the main research question that came to mind for me when creating this thesis is, for two countries that are very similar in a lot of their environmental factors and are very conducive to entrepreneurship as a whole, why is Korea not conducive to women starting businesses as a whole? And what are the missing links there? What, aside from economy and politics and things like that, that are natural explanations for the problem, what is missing? So my methodologies I used in creating this thesis were, one, a literature review to find some common explanation for missing links and kind of see what was already out there. And then an analysis of 2 different entrepreneurship indexes that focus on women in entrepreneurship to see high indicators in ecosystems of entrepreneurship to kind of figure out what research already existed on entrepreneurial environmental factors. And then third, a data comparison from the World Bank and the US Department of Education to see if I could find any indicators there as well. So some of the common explanations I found from literature were low access to funds. Women just either didn't know how or weren't gaining access to venture capital funding, mainly because there's a lot of male representation in business already. And in a lot of cases, men were more likely to fund people who looked like them and who they could relate to. And secondly, that gender norms are very high still in Korea, stemming from Confucianism. And those are still things that are maybe not taken at face value in Korea, but are still underlying in a lot of how life works, as women are expected to be the head of a family unit, of a household. And oftentimes, if they did start business, they weren't innovative or filling market gaps, but they were need-based and things that women could do out of their homes or weren't necessarily official businesses that they were running. So, oh, sorry. The next thing that I found in my analysis between the female entrepreneurship indexes were on the MIWE that Korea was very low in the number of women business, professional, and technical leaders that they had. Women labor force participation overall was very low. And in general, there was a very low societal regard for women who tried to pursue entrepreneurship. And when I say most stratified here, what I mean is the United States was really excelling in these pillars or indicators, and Korea was really lagging behind. So these were kind of those missing links I was looking for. And on the FDI, I got a lot more reflection here that Korea was lagging behind in innovativeness, female leadership again, and highly educated owners. So at the end of the day, a lot of these pillars kind of came down to education and how much support women were having. While there are a lot of organizations already targeting grown-up women and women who are over 25 years old and further into their lives, I found that there was kind of a gap and focusing on young women and focusing on training, support, and mentorship of young women. And so that's something I wanted to look more into as well. And I did, through the World Bank and US Department of Education statistics, I found that since in Korea, you are only required to go to lower secondary or middle school. We see here we have about an 80% completion rate of students in Korea. But then when we go to post-secondary or high school, only 35% of students, females in particular, were completing a high school degree and going on to college after that. And even further from that, there's a very, very low percentage, 16% compared to the United States, 73% of students who have had experience in vocational, career and technical education training so that they could be exposed to these career paths that might be considered non-traditional in Korea because of their systemic ideals that kind of still are upheld in the country today. So some of the main conclusions I had from all this research was that there's, again, a very big gap in the effort that's put in to find funding for women who are already in the part of their life where they can start businesses. And there's less focus on stemming that idea and support in young women and showing that they do have the ability to do that. Female students are not attending high schools at high rates either, mainly because, and this is changing this year, Korea is moving into having free high school, but for a while now, if you were in poverty, you weren't afforded the ability to go to high school, and that there was just little mentorship and institutional support for these young women. So there was no inspiration for them to pursue entrepreneurship overall. So most women just follow traditional high school paths where they wouldn't be exposed to any entrepreneurial training or business training at that. In order to do that, you have to apply to specialized high schools, which are expensive and very stressful to apply to. It's very similar to a US university SAT applications style. And so I think that there was like a really big gap there that common literature and organizations for women support just were not targeting at all in Korea, but the US does have. So my recommendations as of right now were to allocate government funding to career and technical and vocational education in traditional secondary and post-secondary schools, so middle and high schools, and even into college. The United States allocates a lot of Perkins funding each year to make sure that students in any traditional public high school are afforded the ability to be exposed to career and technical education in any field that they want to go to and really learn about being an entrepreneur, starting a business. The second thing is to promote and implement women's institutes in post-secondary and tertiary schools, so high school and colleges. We've seen the success of that in the Kendra Scott Entrepreneurial Leadership Institute at UT, and I saw it back at my high school. There are different groups like that I participated in. And so I've seen the success in it, and I've seen the institutes and high schools and colleges around the globe that were included in my thesis. And so I feel that that is a really strong recommendation that hasn't been looked at before for Korea. And then the final one is to educate Korean families on the importance of girls' education. I found that the US Department of Education does this really cool thing where each year they kind of do the breakdown of what the government is funding and why Korean technical education is really important, why women representation is really important, and shows the numbers as to how that's conducive to a greater economy, to a greater society in the United States as a whole. And right now, Korea is not doing anything like that. So I think that that could definitely help target a lot of the systemic nature against women pursuing entrepreneurship that's found in Korea. So honestly, when it comes down to it, just a big conclusion in my thesis is focusing on the young women in Korea and making sure that there's a lot of funding, support, and mentorship for those young women who are going to then go into the workforce and become entrepreneurs. So that kind of concludes my presentation. Thank you all. I'd love to take questions now.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brittney. Well, I do have a question here, and I just have to scroll down to it from Ashton Wilson, who writes, you explained why you chose Korea, but was there a personal reason for choosing to cover women in entrepreneurship?
Yeah, definitely. I kind of touched on it like a little bit about the Kendra Scott Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Institute. It's something that we have at UT that I've been able to be a part of, and I've also worked for Kendra Scott, and I work under another female founder right now in the interior design business, Amy Lutz, and they have been some of the most inspiring people to me throughout my college career, and I've seen the power of female founders and what they can do in their communities. And it's something that I'm aspiring to when I get out of college for sure. So I I think that was definitely a big part of why I picked entrepreneurship on a personal level, but also in my thesis in the beginning, I go a lot into the power of female and why it is so important, because when you increase the number of female entrepreneurs, you increase global economies as a whole. And honestly, I think Boston Consulting Group did this study where they basically said that we could double global GDP in the next 10 years if we were able to just, in a perfect world, have all these indicators like fixed so that we could have a really conducive environment for female entrepreneurs. And I just thought that was really cool and empowering as a woman myself.
Very good. I have another question, this one from Ashlyn Roberts. Is there anything you wish you could have done in terms of methodology that you weren't able to do, and why?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me, and like I know a lot of students doing their thesis also had this because of the pandemic, I wasn't able to really conduct primary research that I wanted to, speaking to actual female founders in Korea and students in Korea. And I also would have loved to go to Korea and really like be immersed in that and see it firsthand. So, I mean, at times it was kind of a weird imposter syndrome talking about a country that I haven't personally been to. And I haven't personally like spoken to a lot of people about this topic on. So yeah, that's definitely something I would have liked to do, is just gather primary research and really like be in the environment myself.
One of the nice things about Plan II, had there been no COVID, is that we have an international travel fund that allows students to actually go to the countries they're looking at and do some research. Sadly, this generation, this particular class, was unable to do that, which made the normally difficult senior thesis project even more difficult for them. So I want to just take a moment and give all four of you kudos for going through this process in the midst of a pandemic. That had to be extremely difficult. So any more questions? I don't see any more. Okay, so let's move on to our next presenter, Adam Trevino. He will be discussing the evolution of feminist dystopian fiction. Adam, the floor is yours, or I guess the screen is yours.
Take it. So my name is Adam Trevino. Thank you all for coming. Just like the moderator just said, I'm writing about the evolution of feminist dystopian fiction. And just to start off this project, I'm going to give a brief description over what dystopian fiction is, so we all get an understanding. It's essentially just fictional novels where there's some sort of overbearing or totalitarian oppressive governmental regime running a society, and it usually follows the characters and they try to navigate their lives throughout this these troublesome societies. And they became really popular around the early to mid 1900s. You know, everyone knows 1984, Brave New World, and they kind of came back into popularity around the early 2000s. I'd say there was a boom in the young adult subgenre of dystopian fiction. You know, movies and books like The Hunger Games, Maze Runner, Divergent, those kind of brought it back to the forefront. And even recently, the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of these classic dystopian novels like A Brave New World in 1984, they've found their way back into the top of bestseller list nationally, perhaps as a result of the turbulent political climate we live in, who knows. But interestingly also, in addition to this comeback of older novels, there seems to be a new batch of contemporary dystopian novels being written since around 2015, 2016, that cover a vast array of concerns or fears society may have, such as, you know, fear of capitalism and large corporations, fear of technology and its increasing influence, fear of worsening environmental conditions, all sorts of things. And when I was doing research for my thesis, I knew I wanted to write about some of these newer novels. And the most popular subgenre that I found with the most critically acclaimed recent novels written was this feminist dystopian fiction subgenre, which was made popular probably by Margaret Atwood, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale in 1985, which is somewhat known as the gold standard of feminist dystopian fiction. You know, all these new novels are clearly influenced by hers and essentially just modern retellings of this story. And so for my project, I wanted to pick two contemporary feminist dystopian novels that were critically acclaimed and similar to Atwood's, clearly influenced. But I wanted to look at the subtle differences that could have existed, you know, and looking at the differences between these two new novels and the older novel, kind of generalize how has this genre evolved as a whole, what sort of changes have taken place. And then, by analyzing these novels, doing a close reading, comparing and contrasting the similar aspects, and then using historical context from, the 80s and today, try to contextualize these observations and speculate, why do these differences exist, or why are they the same? So the first major conclusion I came to was when I was kind of comparing and contrasting the experiences of people of color in these novels. And I will say, in The Handmaid's Tale, which was written in 1985, it is not really a diverse cast of characters. It's about 95% white characters. The few characters of color are rarely mentioned. And that has drawn criticism from some of Atwood's critics. And it kind of means that she's not able to give a full critique of the sort of oppression women face, because she's not even considering race as a thematic element. But by contrast, these newer novels, Future Home of the Living God and Red Clock, I forgot to mention them, Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich and Red Clocks by Lenny Zumas. And just some brief plot summaries for, just in case you haven't read the novels, very brief. The Handmaid's Tale is about culmination of several different environmental catastrophes, toxic waste spillage, air pollution, a syphilis epidemic results in a drastic decline in birth rates. And as a result, a sort of religious fundamentalist government rises to power and starts heavily oppressing women and men alike, and kind of casting people into different classes in society and forcing all viable women to have children of rich men. And Future Home of the Living God, very similar. It's another sort of evolutionary disaster, not caused by environmental disaster, but kind of randomly. It's in Future Home that's like a sort of backwards evolution. There's a bunch of prehistoric creatures just popping up out the blue. Babies that are being born are starting to resemble humanoid creatures from the past. Viable birth rates are down, and similar to Handmaid's Tale, as a result, another sort of religious fundamentalist group comes in, starts imprisoning women, forcing them to have children. And finally, Red Clocks, kind of different in the fact that it's not really sci-fi or anything. It's somewhat, the society in Red Clocks is somewhat similar to ours in that the only differences are there's this new law that's been implemented that completely criminalizes abortion, heavily criminalizes it. You can get 3 to 5 years for even attempting to have one. And there's another new law that's coming into place that says only married people can adopt. And so that novel follows the main characters. They try to navigate through these tough decisions they have to face. So going back to the comparison, I'm sorry to interrupt with that plot summary. I should have done that earlier. But these two newer novels, much more diverse cast of characters. They're much more representative of the sort of oppression that real people of color, and especially women of color, face and have faced historically. And there's examples throughout the novels of, sort of experiences that we can look back on history and see like, oh, this happened to them. And that contrasts Atwood, because in her novel, it's all white characters, and that has drawn criticism. But on top of that, to exacerbate the problem, the experiences the main character, Offred, are essentially just appropriated from the real world historical experiences that Black slave women faced in mid 19th century America. And so the critics have said, you're just going to take this history and throw it onto white women. You're kind of disrespecting the African American community. And I agree. So Future Home and Red Clocks, much better job at representing diversity, inclusivity, and this could be attributed to the feminist movement as a whole. The latter part of the 20th century, they kind of started to be a little more inclusive of non-white women and just all sorts of women. And so and the second major comparison that I was able to draw or contrast is in The Handmaid's Tale. The dystopian society is very well fleshed out, very well developed. There's tons of details about, how this environmental catastrophe came to place, how this government rose to power, what sort of tactics the government uses to oppress its citizens. But by contrast, these two newer novels, they don't have those sorts of details, In Future Home, the Living God, we hear that evolution is going backwards. We never understand why. We don't know how this government rose to power. We don't really know what their main tactics are. We just kind of follow the experiences of the main character, who is somewhat in the dark because, all the information that she was receiving is now gone. And so by keeping the characters in the dark, Erdrich is keeping the readers in the dark too, and thus kind of representing, the vulnerability that we face when we lack quality information. And this lack of information could also mirror the sort of unexpected, the fact that women are kind of vulnerable to this sort of oppression at any point in their lives. You never really know when stuff like this could happen. You never know when an anti-abortion law is going to be passed, or stuff like that. And so a good way to think about this is critic Tom Moylan in his book Scraps of the Untainted Sky. He talks about anti-utopia versus critical utopia. And an anti-utopia, he kind of classifies all the older dystopian novels like Brave New World, 1984, like that, where they place a heavy amount of focus on the sort of dystopian government and how they operate. And by doing so, kind of send the message that this government has total power. There is absolutely no way one can resist them, and it's not even worth trying. But conversely, he kind of classifies newer dystopian novels as critical dystopias, which kind of emphasize the modes of resistance that people can take in the face of this sort of institutional oppression. And I would argue that Future Home and Red Clocks do exactly this. They don't focus on the hopelessness of the scenario or, how this government is operating. Instead, they focus on the struggles of the characters, the way the characters come together to fight the sort of resistance. And from a lot of unexpected places too, these characters find sources of resistance to the institutional oppression. And so by doing so, I would argue these newer authors, first of all, I would argue that these newer authors, by lacking focus on the dystopian elements, are kind of blurring the lines between dystopia and reality. In interviews, Erdrich and Dumas have both said, I figured I'm trying to write this novel to have it say, we're not that far from, the sort of dystopian society. I mean, you can look at any number of states and see anti-abortion laws being proposed and even passed through state legislatures. And federally, you hear talks of Roe v. Wade being canceled. And so they're trying to send this message, we're not that far, but at the same time, by focusing on these modes of resistance, they're sending the message that even in the face of this seemingly extremely powerful oppression, we can find sources of resistance and find inspiration to move forward since it seems all hope is lost. So in conclusion, I would say that these newer novels, by including more diverse cast of characters and kind of being a little more representative of the sorts of oppression that communities of color, and especially women of color, faced and have faced, they're more appealing to community as a whole. And by increasing this realism, blurring the lines between dystopia and reality, they're kind of saying, we're not that far, but there's still hope. We can still find ways to fight this oppression. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Adam. That was really interesting. I have a couple of questions from the audience. The first question is from my old colleague, the dear and wonderful Elsie Rebolloso. And she asks, first says, FYI, Lenny Zumas was a Plan II Joins Reading Room guest speaker when Red Clocks came out in 2018. Were you able to attend that talk? How did you decide to research this topic?
Unfortunately, I did not. I was not aware that she was. Had I known, I would have tried to make it. It's probably very interesting. But how did I decide to research this topic? Well, I'm a rhetoric major, so I'm a Plan II and a rhetoric major. So a lot of my, my coursework involves just rhetorically analyzing, pieces of, literature, speeches, stuff like that. And so I knew I wanted to kind of do a deep dive into some comparative literature analysis. And I've always been interested in dystopian fiction. And I was extremely interested to see that there have been several new novels written in the last 4 or 5 years. And like I said, when trying to decide which ones exactly to write about, I noticed that this subgenre of feminist dystopia seemed to be the most prominent, sort of newer wave of dystopia. And so I said, it's worth analyzing. I want to see how it's evolved. And I've read The Handmaid's Tale before. I thought it was very good too. So I kind of just wanted to dive a little deeper into that and see how the genre's changed and why, think about why and, what this means for society moving forward, what kind of messages these authors might be trying to send.
Okay, we have another question from Sarah Sestamoinen. Hi, Sarah. This is like old home week for me. Adam, I appreciate you specifying where Future Home and Red Clocks reflected and represented POC and Indigenous perspectives and lived experiences, or failed to, compared to Atwood's. were there differences in the portrayal and visibility of trans women and femmes across the three novels you examined?
I'm not gonna lie. I don't think that there was any sort of representation of those sorts of non-binary women in the novels. And that sort of lack of representation has drawn criticism. Well, admittedly, Red Clocks is not as representative of, non-white women as it should be. And some critics have argued that Dumas could have done more in her, exploration of this society. Like I said, a law came into place that said only married couples can adopt. And one of her critics has written, why didn't she write about a homosexual couple that's tried to adopt a child? What sort of troubles would they run into with the federal government? So yeah, I mean, clearly there's work to be done. These novels aren't the best at representing all communities, but I think they are a step in the right direction, at least a little bit. And I think they're setting good groundwork for, the genre going forward, hopefully. And sending good messages while they're at it too, I think.
Okay, I have one question for you. There are no more from the audience, Adam. Wait, maybe there's suddenly one. Elsie is asking another question, so I'll go to her instead of me. Is The Handmaid's Tale better than the series? I assume on TV is what Elsie means. I haven't experienced either, but feel that books are usually better.
Unfortunately, I have not seen the TV series. I've heard nothing but good things about it. I will say that it's like 3 seasons deep, and only the first season adapts the novel. Like the next 2 are kind of just their own thing. So, I mean, I can't imagine it's worth watching past the first season. But I agree. I think the books are always probably better, kind of a little more detail offered. And yeah, that's about it. I wish I could talk more on the TV show. I'm planning to watch it, after I finish this thesis. I think it'd be interesting to go back and see how they handle these sorts of things.
You probably didn't have a whole lot of time on your hands to be watching TV, I'll wager, Adam,
Yeah.
Given the demands of the senior thesis. I have a quick question. I study history, and as you were talking, I was thinking of the historian E.H. Carr, who said, if you want to understand history, learn about the historian who wrote it, and learn about the world in which that historian grew up and wrote. So my question is, I think you've done a very good job of telling us about the context within which these novels were written. Did you look at all at the biographies of the writers?
Yeah, I've done some research into their life. I've read a bunch of interviews with them. I'll start with Atwood. She stated clearly that all the stuff in her novel is nothing that has never happened in history before. The stuff she's either witnessed growing up or heard of. She was around the 70s. There was a lot of rise of totalitarian regimes like in Iran, and I think Romania banned abortion outright in the late 70s. And in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan came into presidency. His Supreme Court, there was speculation they were going to overturn Roe v. Wade, and all these anxieties kind of influenced her into writing this sort of novel. And the same thing with, I haven't done much research into Dumas's biography, but I know Erdrich started writing Future Home of the Living God 2004, right when George W. Bush got elected, because we were kind of seeing a lot of potential restriction on women's rights. The global gag rule was put back into effect. Medicare funding for Planned Parenthood was cut, and so she started writing this novel. She took a hiatus for several years, and then she said after Donald Trump got reelected in 2016, she came back to it and finished it in 2017. And it's just interesting to see how these novels are clearly influenced by the historical context that they were written in, and that's how I think that kind of is true for dystopian novels as a whole. Even like in the 40s and 50s, the novels written then were reflective of the fears that they had back then, and the ones written 10 years from now are probably reflective of how society is then.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. I think now we move on to Olivia Cardenas, who is going to talk about her thesis entitled Step Up Now, Step Back Later, The Politics of Gender, Consumerism, and Female Sacrifice, 1941 to 1945.
Hello. Is my screen sharing?
I can see your screen share. I don't, there it is. Now you've got presentation mode. Excellent.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Cardenas. Before I begin, I want to thank my amazing supervisor, Dr. Stoff, my second reader, Dr. Gutterman, and my family and friends who have listened to me talk about World War II for about 3 years now. Ever since I started doing the Normandy Scholars Program, I've been endlessly fascinated by this entire time period, and particularly women's lives and experiences during it. So I just want to thank everyone for being so supportive. Wait, okay, great. So my research question is, how did popular culture promote continuity in women's roles? As I mentioned, I did the Normandy Scholars Program on World War II, and in my time in that program, I began researching the role of the wartime homemaker and what her experiences were like. And so I was exposed to the advertisements of the time period, and I was absolutely gripped by them. And so that's why I kind of decided to expand this project and focus on the role of women more generally, whether they were homemakers or also in the labor force. And a comment on why popular culture is so relevant in this time period is that the advertisements we see, the women's magazine articles that were around, the propaganda films that were created through Fox and by the government, these are all reflections of government and corporate attitudes, because during this time period, there is such an extreme collaboration and cross-pollination between government agencies like the Office of War Information and Madison Avenue through the War Advertising Council, and then magazine industry through the Magazine Bureau. So the popular culture and some of the images that I'll be showing here are very revealing of those specific government and corporate attitudes. So I kind of already alluded to it, but my methodology involved doing a qualitative analysis of women's magazine articles, advertisements, propaganda films, and then when I could access them, government communications that kind of exposed the strategy and underlying attitudes that helped shape the images and the media that predominated in the time period. So ultimately, what I argue is a revisionist argument. Most histories emphasize the overwhelming change that took place in women's lives. And while it's true, a lot changed for women and unprecedented numbers of women did enter into the labor force, I argue that popular culture helped set the tone for continuity in the post-war period by sending messages regarding three main themes: domesticity, self-presentation, and motherhood. And these comprise the main chapters of my thesis. So we'll look more closely at each of those. In this image, you see a General Electric advertisement and some context about the war period. So consumer companies like General Electric, Hoover Vacuums, all of these companies converted to war production during the period. That means they stopped making dishwashers, they stopped making tanks, and they started making war goods and war materials. And so companies like General Electric worried about what would happen in the post-war period if they stopped advertising, if they stopped reminding the American consumer of their name and of their brand. So essentially, Madison Avenue and corporate America team up with the Office of War Information to promote war aims while also keeping brand names like General Electric in American women's minds. So this ad is very revealing in that we see this woman in the factory, and she's asking, why can't we wash dishes by pushing a button? And if you look more closely at the text, she's apparently so distracted by her dreams of domesticity that when she's working in the factory, she's thinking about the General Electric dishwasher she'll be able to buy after the war. So there's a lot of things going on here, but one of the main ones is that producers like General Electric that had a lot of money to be made from promoting an image of women returning to domesticity and being primarily household consumers rather than producers. And so through images like this and through articles that continued to represent homemaking and domestic tasks as a woman's primary responsibility, the message was very clear to women that even if they had left the home, they remained responsible for it, and that the reward for their wartime sacrifices would of course be incredible after a victory home was filled with the products of General Electric and other companies that have been advertising. The second image here is a Ladies' Home Journal article that is entitled, "Even Slim Girls Have Hips. How's Your Girdle Area These Rubberless Days?" So some general context behind this article is that across the American home front, there is a widespread need to conserve things. And some of the things that needed to be conserved involved fabric and rubber. And so this affected wartime fashion in big ways. Clothing generally lost its frills, it became shorter, it became more revealing. And undergarments, which women had traditionally relied upon, these became less supportive. Some people describe it as hell in the lingerie department. So despite the fact that women were now more exposed and their undergarments were less supportive, popular culture sent the message that they needed to maintain traditional standards of thinness and beauty. And so during the time period, a lot of the literature is like this article here, encouraging women to exercise and lose weight. And it's interesting that even something as personal and intimate as the body and the way one managed it was an area of concern for corporate America, because presentation is a very critical way that women could perform their adherence to traditional ideals and traditional femininity. Okay. This image, how to start a childcare program, is particularly interesting because before the war period, there was not group care of small children. It was traditionally expected that women would take care of their children before they went to school, and it was just widely thought of as the responsibility of women to do this. And so the fact that childcare programs even emerged in the time period is a large departure. But as you can see in this image, it was the expectation of working women to start these childcare programs and untangle the extremely complicated bureaucracy involved in assessing the needs of a community and lobbying for funds from the government. So I argue that because all of these steps were asked of an already extremely busy, overworked woman, the childcare programs that the government had offered to subsidize are largely a failure, and they don't materialize. And the ones that do exist, the ones that women really benefit from because they've been working and now they have this opportunity to have stable childcare for their children, those childcare programs are defunded by the government in the post-war period almost immediately. So motherhood remains a major site of continuity, because even though there's this small departure in funding and support for public child care, at the end of the day, the support is temporary. And the message is that women's roles and existence outside the home is temporary, because where they really belong is inside of it, taking care of their children. So ultimately, these three factors kind of come together to promote a life of continuity and a return to the way America had been before the war. The main takeaway I have from all of this is just how complicated people's personal beliefs are and how they interact with the messages that are being sent by propaganda. When I first started researching this 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't know much about how women felt and how they navigated the propaganda that we've just looked at. It was easy to kind of impose my 21st century perspective and see all of the repression and the limitation that kind of shine through in these images. But what's really been fascinating is seeing the way women, in some cases, embrace these traditional roles and did want to return to a domestic life and did want to return to a life solely devoted to motherhood. And of course, others wanted to continue working. But I think ultimately this project has just shown me how much people have agency to kind of define how they see the roles and how they want to navigate femininity and womanhood. And so, yes, you have these messages that are being sent from the highest levels of government, but you also have individual women making choices for their own, albeit limited choices with little structural support in the post-war period. And I think that that's really the point of history, is seeing how individuals interact with their environment and interact with, popular culture and public policy to chart their own path. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. We do have a question here. Let me scroll down and get it from Ashley Dutzer. Do you still see companies today using the same tactics, even though they might be more veiled?
I think yes, because a lot of the ideas that are at play kind of get to the heart of how Americans think about women. I mean, we're seeing a lot of these issues surrounding motherhood during the COVID pandemic and issues around who is going to take care of young children in a time of national crisis. So I think because these issues still exist, that of course they're going to end up, playing out in advertisements and in popular culture, albeit like the times have shifted and the needs are different of these companies. I think that it's probably definitely still there.
Okay, I don't see another question here, but I have a question for you, Olivia. Could you tell us a little bit about why you think women embrace these traditional roles during the war? You said that was something that actually surprised you, is finding women who were eager to return home if they'd worked outside of the home during the war, why they were eager to return to the home after the war and take on some of the roles that the government was telling them they should.
I think it's multifaceted. So first, being mothers and being in the home, these are areas of power for women traditionally. These are areas where they are considered the experts. And so there's a lot of, appeal in going back and returning to the activities where your expertise is validated in a larger social context. Like, women in this time period are not valued as much as workers, but as mothers, their instincts and their behavior is legitimized as socially acceptable and socially good. So I think that women are socialized to be mothers definitely plays a role. But then, of course, a lot of women in oral histories emphasize how difficult labor was. I mean, there are a lot of industrial accidents that women talk about, and just the sheer physical exhaustion of the job, I think, plays a role for a lot of women in wanting to kind of, if not return to the home, return to a more traditionally feminine industry. And then, of course, there's not structural support for women with young children to keep on working. It would be very difficult for someone to find childcare for a child under 5 and also manage a job. So there's just a lot of factors at play that made it easier to return to the status quo before the war.
We have another question from the audience, from Joe. Did women try to fight back against these stereotypes?
Yes, and that has been one of the most exciting things about my research is seeing, particularly I've found the op-eds very interesting, of women really pushing to keep the childcare centers that had been established and talking about how critical this government support was in allowing women to balance the role of being a mother and then also having a career. So I think that you see a lot of ways women fight back. You see them trying to organize around childcare. You see women embrace new fashions. Women wore slacks in factories, often for practical reasons, but it kind of became a political stance in certain circles to keep on wearing them. You see women that are involved in the government and the Women's Bureau really pushing for the employment rights of women in the post-war period. So yeah, women definitely fought back against stereotypes and tried within the time period to use the resources and power available to them to create a new path forward.
Well, thank you, Olivia. That was very good. And what I'd like to do now is, first, I have a little bit of housekeeping to ask of Samantha. Samantha, could you give me your email address? I couldn't find it. Samantha? Well, I'll have to get that from you later. What I'd like to do now is call up all four of our presenters and ask them a question for them to answer individually, but also in a way as a group. And my question is this. If you were advising someone who was going to write a senior thesis next year, what advice would you give them about how to do it? You've been through it now, and it's a difficult process. So if you were a supervisor, let's say, of a senior thesis, what would you tell your supervisee about what he or she or they needed to do? Let's start with, I'm hoping to start with Samantha. Are you there? Okay, so we'll go to Brittney.
Hi, yes, sorry.
Oh, you are
I
here. Great,
apologize for
Samantha.
that.
Hi.
Sorry, someone was calling me. Could you repeat the question one more time? It was to a supervisee, if you were a supervisor.
Yes, what advice would you give to an up-and-coming senior thesis writer about how to do this?
So honestly, I would suggest that reverse order of kind of going through things. Like I felt like when I was creating my presentation and my PowerPoint for my thesis symposium, I was really outlining all my ideas and directions I was explaining and wanting to explore my paper. So I would start off with, really having a strong outline and making sure you have all the research and data to support those topics. And then from there, focusing on just writing and making sure that you have, the page counts and the pages, and that you're actually substantiating what you're researching onto your paper and onto your thesis.
Brittney?
Yeah, that's a
What
really good
advice would you give?
Yeah, I'd say, I guess I have two little things I was thinking of. One, pick a topic that you like and that you love and that you are going to fall in love with, because it makes it so much easier to write when you're excited and you want to learn about it and you want to write about it. That would be my first advice. And then my second one would probably be, oh my gosh, I might have just lost the second one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, my brain is fried today. I'm so sorry, everyone. But just don't be married to an idea. You're going to end up probably somewhere that you didn't think you were going to end up, and you're going to take a lot of twists and turns, and that's totally normal and not something to freak out over. That's something that I definitely took me a bit to understand, with my advisor saying it's okay, like that's totally normal.
Adam?
Yeah, just to build off what she just said, you definitely have to pick a topic that you're interested in. You're going to spend tens to even hundreds of hours, doing research, writing. So it better be something that you're willing to spend that time putting in. I think that's one of the most important things. And I think that'll make my second point even easier. And this might seem a little obvious, but don't procrastinate it. For me at least, this was the first time I had this extremely large independent project with little to no deadline set. So you kind of have to make yourself do the work, at a constant pace, or risk falling behind, and you can't write 60 pages in a week, that's not feasible. So you got to be interested in it. You got to be willing to put in the time, and you got to, be mature about it, But I think if you do those things, you'll be fine.
Okay, Olivia?
Yeah, I would say, kind of echoing what Brittney pointed out, like you're going to be spending a lot of time on this, so make it a topic that is genuinely exciting to you. But then going off of that, I was so genuinely excited and entertained by reading all of the women's magazines articles and like just the source material in this time period that I overwhelmed myself in the research. And I think that it's just really important to know like when to stop. Like, you're writing a thesis and not a book. And within the time constraints, I think you just have to be mindful of like how much you're trying to accomplish with your topic. And then like knowing when to stop research and just start, synthesizing your ideas and getting the words on the page.
Very good. Yeah, I would add one thing to what all of you have said, and that is pick the right supervisor. You want someone who meshes with your style of research and writing and thinking. I remember when I was graduate advisor going to a meeting of graduate advisors over at the Tower, and the then vice provost for graduate affairs said, well, choosing an advisor for your dissertation is like picking a dog. And I thought, what? What did you say? Picking a dog? And she said, yes. She said, if you want a German Shepherd, don't buy a Chihuahua. In other words, what you want to do is match up your personality, your research style, the kind of help you need and want with the person who's going to be helping you. And that's really a critical feature. And my sense is from what all of you have said that you did pick the right advisors, that you did pick the right supervisors, and that they were very helpful. At least I hope they were. Anybody want to add anything before we sign off here?
I think another thing would just be kind of going off what you said about thesis advisors and, you know, choosing who you pick. My advice would be to kind of think of the classes where you've been super interested, or for me personally, I had a little notes page on my phone, and every time in a class I heard something that applied to my idea, I'd write it down. So looking back and seeing what classes, you know, really are involved with your topic, and looking back and seeing who those professors are could be a really good way to start your process for finding an advisor.
Very good. Well, thank you all. We all appreciate. Sarah's got a comment here. Let me add what she said. And don't be afraid to ask your professors for recommendations, exclamation point. I was introduced by a past professor to both of my advisors, and they were great. Okay, well, thank you for all of the presentations, and thank you, audience, for your questions. And Ryan, our host, I think our time is done.